This title comes from the very common phrase we get when we do something cool, something along the lines of, wow, you're such a wizard. I wanted to share our process so that game developers and sound designers everywhere can collaborate more easily. But first, I'm Em, and I'm the creative director at A Shell in the Pit. We are 16 people who mostly work on sound for indie games, but we've also made our own game, Fish Game, which was out in the lobby, and we do trailers. So I've been working on sound for indie games for 8 years now, and these are all the games I've contributed to in that span of time. Each one has had its own unique auditory needs, and I've learned many lessons about how to collaborate with all of you along the way. So I'd just like to share some of these lessons, and I'll use a few of these games as an example. And this note is from my perspective as a sound designer, so there won't be too much about music, also because there's only 20 minutes, so I have to move really fast. So why should you care about sound? It influences feeling and sets the tone, like this eerie wind. It makes actions more satisfying. It gives cues and conveys a lot of information without having to animate everything. And it helps make the game feel alive and creates a sense of immersion. It helps with accessibility, and it can make certain actions iconic. So now that you've realized how great it is, the first step in your sound journey should be to play some games and listen to the sound design very closely. And you can do this in real life too. Sound is often affecting you subconsciously, but all you need to do is pay attention to it and you'll learn about it really quickly. Try interacting with different objects while you're playing. Notice if they're making a different sound depending on the velocity of the impact or surface. Hear how no matter how many times in a row you interact with something, it always sounds random, just like in real life. Play with the character, how does sound communicate their vibe, and listen to how the ambience is setting the mood. Pinpoint the tone of the overall design, and then save references when you like something. Once you've listened to the sound of a broad range of games, start to narrow down the ones that are similar to what you want to make. So you can use film for this as well. And it's not only a great way to start thinking of sound more, it's invaluable to a sound designer starting on a project. So you can record the game clips or share YouTube links or make sound with your voice. And then as you're doing that, you can start thinking about how you want people to feel while they're playing it. So this is probably something you're already doing, but because sound has so much power in evoking feeling, it can really help to communicate the sense of cohesion to think of it through this lens. And each of these emotions can either be a single element of the sound or the entire theme it's based around. And while it can be helpful to use past games as inspiration, I'd recommend thinking about it from a fresh perspective as well. So, for example, adding organic sounds to a pixel game can be a cool way to make the game feel more unique. I like to be as weird as possible with this. So you have the idea of how you want your game to sound, but when do you start the process of adding it? You can keep sound in mind right from the beginning with the exercises I just mentioned and by making notes in your design docs. And if you're doing it yourself, you can start putting sounds in as soon as you have something to attach them to. Sound can often help influence the design of a game, so the earlier is the better. It can be super productive to hire a sound designer early as well, but the easiest time is once you have a playable demo or any kind of measurable chunk of the game so that they can audit it and you can use that to predict the size and come up with a budget. And once you have a total number of sounds, the budget can be negotiated in many different ways, whether it's hourly, on a per asset basis, with revenue share, or a combination of each. Just make sure you have a contract. And then once the process is finished, the sound designer can convert their list into an asset list to work off, which for us looks like this. We use ClickUp, which we have customized thoroughly, but you can use Excel or any project management software like Jira or Notion. We like to put sounds directly onto the tasks and do our internal review with this, and then filter them by assignee, stage, and use tags and priorities. And then we categorize our work into different stages for whether we need a video of a sound, if it needs review from an audio director, or what the programmer needs to do. And we also make sure to stick to a naming convention, which is really important. Do this and use prefixes, and just know that organization is one of the most important aspects of game audio. So this asset list will normally include these categories, which I'll break down for you in relation to the game feel that I listed out. First, we have ambience, which is the sound of the environment. One of the ways we wanted to define the feel of Pacific Drive was eerie, and the ambience helps sell that a lot. They're often what influences feeling and emotion the most. An ambience is usually comprised of 3 elements. The bed is a 1 minute long-ish loop, and it usually has a few layers and can be different depending on the time of day or mood. And then scatter sounds are non-looping, what we call one-shots, and trigger at a random time and space around you. They help make it feel like the world is alive and evolving. We added weird and alarming metallic sounds to the zone here, and it was fun watching people get spooked out by them, even though there was nothing around them. And spot sounds are also loops, but tied to a location in the game. So for example, that red light in the distance, that's a scatter. Has a sound that gets louder as you approach. You're kidding me right now. Oh. And you can get creative with these. For example, you can use them to make an area feel foreboding so the player doesn't want to approach. Next, let's talk about Foley. In games, we usually refer to Foley. It's not playing. It's fine. Isn't that? Mouse click. Oh, yeah. It's all right.
Try one last thing. Where's the mouse? Oh, there it is. Not working.
Cannot play media.
What? Sorry. Cannot play media. I'll try the next one.
Yeah. So with Foley, in games we usually refer to Foley as any sound a character makes. So we have footsteps that sound different depending on the surface and have special sounds for when they turn and stop. Eichenfeld is an example of a game where we made the feel organic, even though it was pixel art, because we wanted it to feel detailed and grounded. So the sound of this was realistic sounding footsteps. Night in the Woods is a fun example of how sound can help define character. I got the instruction for May to sound heavy like a sack of potatoes, even though she's a cat and cats are normally quite light. Wandersong is a game we often define as lighthearted and silly. And we use the footsteps to add fun and whimsical nature, like these synthy footsteps. You can also animate your character to move in time with the music and replace their footsteps with the ticking of a clock. So next we have sound effects, which we often abbreviate to SFX. Props are often a big part of this category. So when there are objects that use realistic physics, we need to account for the velocity at which they hit the ground, the size, and the surface. For this game, I actually recorded each prop on every different surface, but layering them with the object is a lot more efficient. And we also need to include multiple variations for any kind of action that can be repeated. This just means recording an impact, for example, many times, including about 4 to 10 of those. Untitled Goose Game had a comedic feel to it, which we communicated with subtle and realistic sounds to contrast the abrasive honk. And then SFX that you can interact with usually consist of many categories of sound. For Pacific Drive, a few examples were doors, stations, and in-car upgrades. These sounds are integral to making the action feel satisfying. So we often want to make them bigger and deeper than they would be in real life. So make sure your sound helps enhance that feeling. UI sound also goes a long way in defining the feel and theme of a game. For Chicory, we made a lot of the sound feel relaxing and cute so that it contrasted with the deeper storylines and darker moments. when I'm creating UI sound, I try to envision what source material best represents the game. Chicory is an easy example because it was obviously paint. So I had a paint recording session to create my sound palette and used an array of different actions to cover all the UI. And if you have ideas for this, do you share them with your sound designer? Like what material you think could represent your game the best? Voice can be super helpful in adding emotion and character to your game too. In BC Ball, we decided to act with our human voices for the 100+ animal-inspired BCs, and it really adds a whimsical touch. Even if you don't have the budget for full-on voiceover or voice acting, which I don't have time to get into, having emotes like these adds a lot. Both developers, Greg and Alexis, voiced a large portion of the BCs with me, and were heavily involved with the direction too. So get involved with this kind of stuff as much as you can, because it's really fun. In Goose Game, the subtle and quiet voices help sell the comedy. I often receive direction to make the voices more understated and quiet, including the honk. And then the one note I'll mention about music is to leave space for the game to breathe. And I was a teenage exocolonist. Each season had a playlist of these wonderful songs, and silence was one of them. So it came in randomly and regularly, which gave your ears a quiet break and allowed you to take in the environment and appreciate the music more as well. You can do this randomly, like we did here, or you can have different locations or story moments as silent zones too. And then the next part in the process is capturing video and breaking down how many individual assets are needed for each action. A single animation can have many different trigger points, especially if it's longer, so the sound stays in sync. And if you know certain things are hard to capture, sending a video or instructions is very helpful. It's also extremely helpful to add cheats and test levels, especially if your game has a lot of props or surfaces or any kind of elements. I don't know what I would have done without this in Chia, because I had to capture and test every single one of these props on every one of those surfaces. Talk to your sound designer about what they may find useful, and sound designers ask for stuff like this. Communicate more about what you need. That's not really how I test it. So now I'll explain a little bit about what you call the wizardry or the magic. For me, the first step is often recording. I try to record as much as I can. And if you're doing the sound design yourself and you can't afford a bunch of expensive libraries, I'd recommend investing in a portable recorder. It doesn't need to be top of the line, just whatever you can get will do. And just start recording anything around your house or wherever. Just if you hear something that is inspiring, record it. I recorded probably 80% of the sound for Goose Game in my backyard in East Van at the time. You'd be surprised at how clean a sound can be if you edit it very close. And this goes for any sound designers who are starting out as well. Start building a library. Which is the other resource we have, sound libraries, used for anything we can't record. If you're interested in good starter libraries, I'd recommend Hiss and Roar, Mattia Chelato's libraries, or Boom Magic, which is one of the first ones I bought. Soundly is a great tool for library management and also comes with a large subscription-based catalog of sound, which is super handy. A sound palette is a great way for the sound designer to work efficiently, and you can both ensure everything is cohesive this way. It can either be with a recording session like I did for Chicory, or it can include library sounds like these frogs for Croakwood. It just is putting sounds together to pull from later, basically. Then the most common and affordable editing software for game audio is probably Reaper. Here we can insert, layer up, and magic our sounds. And one of the most common ways to manipulate sound is with EQ. It's a plugin that can shape the frequencies of a sound. It has many uses, but some of the most common are a high or low pass filter, which just means to cut out the low or high end of a sound. So let's say we have an ambience that we want to sound like you're hearing it from inside, or use as a layer to make less noisy, we can do this. One thing to really listen for when you're reviewing sounds is if something is harsh or easy to listen to. I would probably only put a sound like this in a game if I was trying to make the player uncomfortable, which you do want to do sometimes. This is common feedback I have as an audio director to tone down the higher frequencies, which can be more grating. So as we cut those out, you can hear how much easier it is to listen to. You don't want to overdo this though, or your sounds will just be muffled. But you can also stretch sounds. So either to make them less harsh, or just sound bigger and deeper. So you can see the frequency response moving down here on that graph. This is something I use a lot, and it's like super easy. Any sound can basically be anything with this. And if you want the sound design to be magical or grand, you can try reverb. This is often done in the mixing process, but the design sounds can have it baked in as well. I put this plugin, Valhalla Vintage Verb, on everything I can, often just on the default setting with the mix and decay adjustments. But let's say you don't want the sound to be soft and easy to listen to. Maybe it's communicating something negative in the game. We can add in a certain amount of crunchiness with compression or saturation. Decapitator is my go-to for making sounds either big and punchy or ugly. You can kind of hear that harshness coming back in the high end there. So if you have a moment in your game where you want the player to feel uneasy, you can ask your sound designer to make it crunchier. And then there's a whole bunch of other plugins that I don't have time to get into all of them, but Sound Toys has a lot of fun ones. I really like this one, Crystallizer. And if you're just starting out in sound, there's a million plugins you can get. And don't be intimidated by the people who say you need to buy so many. Even just these ones are more than enough to start with. Basically just what I use. And then just a short note, use NVK workflow to render your assets. Next, we have to get our sounds implemented. Implementation software is a means to control sound, ensuring it triggers at appropriate times and responds dynamically to in-game events. This is usually the job of the sound designer and can save a lot of time for you or your programmer. The most common tools are Wwise and Fmod. They're both great. Wwise is a little more robust, and typically smaller indies use Fmod. The choice is totally dependent on your game, so I'm not gonna tell you which one to use. These tools will allow your sound designer to set up containers for variations with pitch and volume modulation, custom attenuations, detailed ambient systems, in-game reverb, and a whole lot more without you having to do anything. And depending on your needs, custom implementation tools can be a great option too. We have a custom implementation engine for Unity called Cuddle, which can be a nice and fluid option. And Greg Lobanov also made a custom editor in GameMaker called the Wandersong Audio Engine that you can actually download and use, and which we've used for Chicory and Beastie Ball as well. And then here's a little example using Fmod of how the impacts in Goose Game were done. So here's the random container of variations with pitch and volume randomization. And then we have an impact velocity parameter that lowers the volume and pitch, the softer the impact, so the less of a high drop it has. And then how a sound gets hooked up into the game varies immensely per game. So you'll have to do that research yourself, but what I can tell you now is to prioritize it. It will take longer than you think. We like to work iteratively and get sounds into the game as soon as possible so we can adjust the volume levels and test how they're feeling. This also gives you the opportunity to hear things with enough time for revisions. And on this note, regardless of your role, when you're testing the game, please listen to the sound and give feedback on how it's making you feel or report bugs. For hookups, I'd recommend asking your sound designer to use priorities if you're busy, and if you're doing them yourself, make sure you have a dedicated person assigned to the task. If time is tight, I'd recommend looking for a sound designer or a team like ours who can do the hookups themselves. You'll just need to add that to the budget. And then once the sound is hooked up, the mixing process can begin. This process includes adjusting the volume of the sounds, adding dynamic plugins, and reverb, and a lot of the fun detail work. And I think the best time for you to give feedback as a developer is when the sound is in the game so you can hear it in context. We typically pre-mix sounds as we implement and then test them once they're in the game and adjust their volume again in context. Then, when we're nearing the end of production on a game, we play through the entire thing several times and take a step back approach in our listening. As a developer, it's a really good idea to budget some time near the end of development to play your game with a focus on the sound, either with your designer or after they've done at least one mix pass, and then make sure everything is sitting well for you. It's important to do this with a focus on sound because often it sits in your subconscious. And lastly, feedback and communication can happen at any point during development. Just make sure you ask what method of communication sound designers prefer, if they want a system, and make it clear who they should be receiving feedback from. Just you, the entire team, you have to sort that all out together. And use feeling to communicate feedback. So make silly sounds, ask when you don't understand something, and always continue to learn about sound. Also, whatever tool you and your team are using to communicate, please add us to all the channels. Even if it's not sound-centric, being in a Slack channel about the story or animation can give us ideas and help us work together better. Which, on that note, thank you so much for listening. I hope this talk helped. Thank you. Feel free to hit us up if you have any more questions after this. I don't know if I went over time, I probably did. Or even if you think we'd be a good fit to work together, we'd love to hear from you with all your questions. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
I think so.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, if you have questions, I see one there.
On the left side here.
Hi, thank you for that talk. Just wondering, how do you determine whether to use bespoke assets versus licensed assets?
I think it can be different for anybody. For me, I really enjoy recording and I really like the unique aspect that brings because nobody else has those sounds. I'm making them and I really like finding sounds in the world. So I always try to record something first. I have a microphone next to my desk and I'll make a sound with my voice or wander the house looking for objects. I'm working on a game right now where I'm using all my dog's toys as most of anything I can make into it. But then a lot of the time with bigger sounds, like I don't know, I don't have thunderstorm recordings or like just stuff that I can't record or don't have time to get. It's often dependent on budget. But then a lot of people work the other way where they will look in a library first and find recording takes more time. This is just my workflow. So it can be anything you want it to be. I do think recording can be more accessible because you don't have to buy multiple libraries all the time. Like you can make, like I showed with the stretching, you can make any sound into whatever you want a lot of the time. Not all the time, but you can get by doing a lot of that.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, me? Okay. Hello. I wanted to know, how do you overcome sound when you are blocked, when you don't have like any new ideas? Do you go for references or do you start recording? When you have to pump like a lot of assets but you're just blocked, what do you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. It happens often because it's hard, as I'm sure you all know, to be creative every day. And sound is definitely more creative, like a lot of, not more creative, but like a lot of creative work for a full day to be like making something full on is really hard. So my first strategy is usually to just do something different, work on a different sound. There's usually like a lot of different aspects of the game and then come back to it later with like a fresh perspective. But then a lot of the time I use like randomness to help me. So I'll look through my libraries or record and pick things at random and like put them into my session and then just try to make whatever I can work. And either like using a sound palette to confine what you have to work with helps a lot with that. Like giving yourself restrictions or randomization can like spark creativity, I find. So yeah, that's my strategy. And I think that was the last question that we had time for. So
Thank you.
but yeah, ask me later.